This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. There's nothing sweeter than baking cookies during the holidays. With Prime, I get all my ingredients delivered right to my door, fast and free, no last-minute store trips needed. And of course, I blast my favorite holiday playlist on Amazon Music. It's the ultimate soundtrack for creating unforgettable memories. From streaming to shopping, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
Rated T to M. Hey, want to hear a PC Game Pass ad? I'll take your silence as a yes. Want new games on day one like Call of Duty Black Ops 6 or Stalker 2? I thought so. How about unlocking all the League of Legends champions when you link your Riot Games account? All for one low monthly price? Well, guess what? We got you. Learn more at xbox.com/PC Game Pass or click the banner. Stalker 2 available November 20th, 2024. Game catalog varies by region and over time. And that's the end of the script.
Conservative. Constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, Bel Cheese announced it's leaving Kentucky. We'll dig into that story. I do think it's pretty interesting. It does speak to government interventionism mixed with government waste, mixed with government being government. We'll dig into that. The Kentucky Legislature notices that the Kentucky Department of Corrections has been transitioning inmates. We'll dig into that story and ask the all-important question, why has this been going on for years and they're just now noticing? Then finally, Casey Crosbie has been endorsed by Trump for co-chair of the RNC. Casey Crosbie, for those of you who are unaware, is a Fayette County native. She was on the Fayette County City Council. I believe she basically still lives in Fayette County, but, travels around. So she is from Kentucky. She was on Lexington's City Council. There, her husband ran for mayor. She's been a part of the Kentucky Party for decades. We'll be digging into her and that endorsement as it does deal with Kentucky. So we'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before I dig down into it, please make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. Of course, if you have the opportunity, please leave a review on the show. Lets others know to tune on in. Lets others know that the information here is somewhat worth listening to. Maybe you enjoy it, maybe you don't. I hope you at least enjoy listening. I don't think you're catching this kind of information necessarily anywhere else on anywhere close to a couple days a week at least basis. But without further ado, let's dig into it. So Bel Cheese is a cheese manufacturer, I believe, processor. They take milk and turn it into cheese in Litchfield, Kentucky, in Grayson County. And this is an interesting story. They announced yesterday that they would be ceasing operations at that plant and moving out of the area. Now, this caught my eye for a specific reason. When I was running for state treasurer in 2023, I had noticed, or I had met with a lot of different mayors and county judge executives, and as such, and when I visited the mayor of Litchfield and sat down and had a little conversation with him, Bel Cheese came up because we're talking about the role of government. You see, Bel Cheese had come to the city of Litchfield saying that if they don't do something about the traffic downtown, then they would be pulling out of the area. You see, Bel Cheese was built where it was built because at the time, and they moved there at the time when they first came into existence, decades ago there, was because Grayson County had a fair amount of dairy farmers. And so they were able to truck in their milk from the countryside there, the dairy farming going on in the area, and they did have to bring it in from out of town, so bringing trucks through town wasn't as much of an issue. But as dairy farming has become less profitable and less, prevalent, that's the word I was looking for, less prevalent in the area, Bel Cheese has had to truck in their milk from other areas, and that means they had to run them through downtown. And downtown Litchfield isn't very well set up for big rigs and tanker trucks carrying hundreds upon thousands of gallons of milk through town. didn't really work well. So Bel Cheese had come to the city saying, we are going to have to pull out of here unless you figure out this traffic situation. And this was back in like 2016, 2017, they came to him and to tell them about this issue. Now, one of the first question of their problem here is on the milk side of things. Why was it that milk was falling off so much in the area? It's not like the farms at that time necessarily were being, bought up. I mean, obviously they get bought up, they get offers for growth and things. But if milk and dairy production is profitable, then it wouldn't be worthwhile to do it. Well, the problem is there's a lot of government regulations that go on federally, but also within the state itself. Remember, the federal government can only regulate interstate commerce. So if the state comes in and produces their own regulations for products that are made in state and then only sold to entities within the state, then they can create their own regulations separate from the federal government. And supposedly what has occurred here is that Bel Cheese, that also has a plant in South Dakota, well, what they buy milk for there, they wanted to go ahead and buy milk for here in Kentucky. But due to Kentucky's regulatory environment, they were not able to purchase milk for the same pricing. And so Bel Cheese was actually paying more for milk than they would in somewhere like South Dakota, but also at the same time, they were paying rates the same as 25 years ago. So you ask a question, why is it? And this is, to be honest here, I've reached out to people in the area and kind of talking about this issue, people who would know, and this is the information I'm getting from them. I'm talking to the mayor, from prior conversations, talking to the mayor and county officials, and then talking to people who work at the plant and higher up at the plant that I knew of that are working there, and kind of getting the background story. So if somebody's super familiar with this story and says I get some information wrong, feel free to email me, info@theandrewshow.com. But this is what I've gotten by talking to people. And so you have to ask the question of, why is milk, both in America, more expensive in Kentucky than South Dakota? Well, there's only one response for that. It would either be the regulatory environment mixed with then the land availability rising to the amount of farms in an area, but also the land value as far as taxing goes. Because remember that milk production has declined within Grayson County and surrounding areas. So the land was already there to dairy farm. Somebody already owned the land, but they sought to get rid of it. And you can only look at Kentucky failing as a government, leading to the lack of milk production within the area, leading to Bel Cheese saying, look, we are trying to buy milk at this price. We can buy it from elsewhere and leave our plant here, I guess, even though we are paying now more for shipping. But you need to at least make it easier for our trucks to get through town. Now, remember, they first brought that up in like 2016. Well, I want to read an article here from this year. This is from K105, sorry. K105 is where I found this website. It's talking about their state senator in the area. Steve Meredith has announced nearly $17 million in roadway funding for Grayson County, including $15 million for the extension of the William Thomas Byway, a project first approved by Litchfield City Council in June 2018. In Grayson County, $15 million in general fund dollars will be used to extend the William Thompson Byway from the southern intersection at KY 259 westwardly to KY 54. The byway extension, after being approved by Litchfield City Council, was placed on the fast track when it was announced by then Governor Matt Bevin at Bel Cheese in Litchfield on September 21st, 2019. Construction on the project was intended at that time to begin sometime in 2022. Then the COVID-19 pandemic struck in March 2020, and along with other obstacles resulted in a project delay. Right-of-way work out South Main Street, though, had been completed. So, to rewind here, City Council approves the project in 2018. Bel Cheese comes to them in 2017-ish area, saying, look, if you don't fix this, we're going to have to move. 2018, they approve it. 2019, Bevin says, we're going to fast track this, and fast track to the government means we'll start construction in 2022. That gets delayed. Stephen Meredith then in 2024 is able to get $15 million to build this byway. And now it is December 2024 and they have started construction on it. I believe they're not even halfway through completion. So it would have been completed, let's say, sometime in 2025. So nearly a decade after Bel Cheese first came to Litchfield saying, look, we can't run our trucks through town, we're going to have to move, they finally are projected to finish the road. Now the road won't even be now completed. By the time the road's completed, Bel Cheese will be moved out of the area. So the government spent $15 million to build a road for one business that now will be leaving before the road's even completed. Now, whose fault is this? Let's look at this from the company standpoint of things, okay? If you're the company, you're saying, look, I mean, it's a business decision. Sure, yeah, I need to produce cheese. I need to buy milk at this price. I can buy it here for cheaper. It's less to ship it, and I'm able to run trucks through town. Now, was Bel Cheese was the issue really for them that they couldn't run trucks through town, they needed this byway built? Or was it really that long-term speaking, they couldn't, it wasn't going to be profitable for them to keep the plant in that area in the first place, but rather move production capabilities elsewhere where they could buy milk cheaper? And this is the question that I think government really needed to ask themselves. What is the real concern here? Because if they took a moment to realize that they created a regulatory environment to de-incentivize Bel Cheese from continuing to exist in Kentucky, they would have not wasted necessarily $15 million on a bypass that wouldn't actually solve the problem of milk not being available at the price point they need available at in Kentucky, but is available in other states. That wouldn't have solved the problem. And maybe would have band-aided the issue that it's easier for them to get their trucks through town. But really asking the question of why are they running so much more, why is this becoming a problem now when, according to reports over time, the plant had lessened its staff. So looking at this from a government's a business standpoint, kind of into government, they're probably giving a reason to the government that could be easily fixed and put a Band-Aid on the situation. But in all reality, the real problem was this giant issue with Kentucky as a whole regarding their regulations and property taxing and as such, but they weren't going to get that fixed in the short term. And so maybe they were hoping when they came to them a decade ago saying build this bypass, that would make it easier for them to run trucks from out of town for the next 10 to 15 years until eventually they just move the production elsewhere. But from the government standpoint of things, one, realizing that you've created the incentive, the situation where a company is now in this position because you've failed to, quote unquote, stimulate the economy, whatever you want to call it. But then also at the same time, you drop $15 million on a roadway for one business that employs 400 people when, by the way, this was announced 2024. If you believe that Blue Oval is really going to open up and hire 5,000 people in the near future, as you've promised and told all of us, as Meredith voted for back in 2022 to give $410 million to Ford to build that plant there. Of course, he didn't know what they were building. That's only about 40 minutes away from Litchfield in the first place. Many of the employees working at that place, you could send there instead of spending $15 million on a roadway. I mean, if you believe government interventionism is the answer here, you could have spent, $5-10 million telling Ford to just hire these people, these 400 from this plant. And if they did so, they would get some sort of incentive because, we've destroyed this cheese business over here, but that takes a moment of interflexion. They cannot lose any employers. That's what government's most worried about, of course. But they, at the same time, they don't want to fix the big problems. That's too hard. What can we do? What kind of handouts can we give you? Which leads to also the thought process of, imagine in 2024, you drop $15 million into a business that's just going to leave in a year, shut down in a year. Would that ever happen in private industry? Of course not, because we would have actually dug into the business. Do you think before getting $15 million, they got any kind of agreements, signed contracts, dug into the books, had experts come in and look at the long-term viability of the Litchfield Bel Cheese plant before dumping $15 million into keeping it? Of course not. Because if an expert had come in, they would have said, don't dump the $15 million. It's a waste of funds. Moving on from there, the Kentucky State Legislature has realized now that the jails are transing the inmates, I guess. Found out about it. There was a moment that the Kentucky Republican Party is sharing around. It's about 2 minutes. Let's take a listen to what was said in this committee by Damon Thayer, and then we'll kind of reflect on the issue. Take a listen to it.
Senator Thayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm a little confused. You filed a reg, but you don't want to talk about it. These policies and procedures were established by internal memo 3 years ago outside of the regulatory or legislative process because you know that they would never pass. And we've just had an election where we saw that these issues regarding transgender surgeries were a factor. And now you want to put it off on the Attorney General, waiting what his opinion will be, which I can probably predict what it's going to be. So why did you come today if you weren't prepared to talk about a reg that your agency promulgated?
Because we're on we didn't come last month, and you all were asking for somebody from the department, so came this way.
Okay, I want to go on the record here before I leave that I don't think the taxpayers of Kentucky are really interested in paying for hormone replacement therapy or transgender surgeries for people who have been found guilty of committing crimes against the Commonwealth. And I think you all just should stop even pursuing this. My prediction is you're going to meet with tremendous resistance from not only this committee, but also the legislature that's going to convene on January 7th. And I think you're wasting our time. I think you're wasting the taxpayers' time. And frankly, I think this administration's pursuit of this out of the mainstream taxpayer-funded procedure is an insult. And you ought to just stop. Because if you don't, it's going to blow up into a much bigger issue than just this little subcommittee today.
So there you go. So there's right. You should we've realized it, just give it up now. Don't waste our time and money on this. But they should still pass a law during the legislature, going ahead and, making sure this doesn't come back. Because the issue here that I have, so I'm very happy that they're realizing it and doing something about it. However, I do have to ask the question. And you can kind of tell from the video, and I've dug into this, talked to some sources here, and it would appear based upon both that video's conversation and my conversation with some other former inmates, that in 2020, 2021 is when this all really started. And it's been going on since. In fact, in 2020, 2021, it was a joke amongst prisoners that when they were waiting in line for whatever medication they were to be handed out, they'd make jokes about it's time to go get your hormones. This was in 2020. In fact, in 2020, 2021, there were flyers going up all around the jails about men now being able to buy panties and bras from the commissary for themselves, and that if they decided they would decide to identify as a transgender woman, the state would issue them a bra, the same bras they issue women in women prisons, they would now be willing to issue and give to men. So what Thayer was hitting upon in the video was the fact that this was a part of a regulation. What I'm hitting on now is just what you could witness if you bothered to walk around the prisons, talk to the prisoners, talk to wardens and other people having them testify, and just bothered to pay some attention to it. Now, of course, I understand, the legislatures have a lot on their plate. They've got a lot they have to look into. And I would understand if they missed it, if it wasn't for the fact that over that period of time, at least between 2020 and 2023, the Jail and Corrections Reform Task Force was a special committee formed by the legislature who was tasked with looking into this. Not this, but just looking into our jail and corrections in general and seeing what needed to be looked at. Even now, there's a juvenile justice task force. And instead of getting off their butts and learning about and going to and visiting the facilities and looking around at the stuff being put up on the walls and taking a look at what's even available in the comp center. I mean, keep in mind, this was out there always, right? You would ask the question of, if you're looking at basic things like what are jails issuing to prisoners, you would find out that they issue bras to men, and you might ask a question, why? When you read through the regulations, this is what you're supposed to be reforming. This is what you're supposed to be regulating. You're recognizing that the system is broke and it needs to be fixed. But then you don't bother to read the regulations. You don't bother to walk around the prison. And apparently these were giant posters and things that were plastered all over the jails about this. And you don't realize that this is an issue. You don't talk to anybody. It's not like they were hiding the people to talk to about this either. For an example, I'm told the major pusher of this is one warden named Amy Robbie. Robbie, I believe is how you say her name. She was actually named Amy. It's spelled R-O-B-E-Y. So I think it's Roby. Amy Roby was named the warden at Luther Luckett Correctional Complex. At one point, she was warden of the year even. And they put her over at Luther Luckett. And then I'm also told that her wife was one of the psychiatrists and counselors within the prison. And that she had a background in working in the mentally ill offenders in the Corrections Psychiatric Treatment Facility. In fact, I'm going to read this press release regarding her appointment to the Luther Luckett Correctional Complex here. The Kentucky Department of Corrections Deputy Commissioner Randy White today announced that Amy Robbie would be named warden at Luther Luckett Correctional Complex. Amy Robbie represents the hardworking and integrity-driven leadership the Commonwealth expects in the position of warden. Her career spans several demanding institutions, beginning as a correctional officer and working her way up to warden. Not only has Robbie exhibited a solid knowledge of prison operations, but she's demonstrated a high caliber of performance during her career. Robbie began her career at the Department of Corrections in 2004 as correctional officer at the Kentucky State Reformatory. In 2005, she was promoted to the classification and treatment officer in the restricted housing unit. The next year, Robbie was promoted to Administrator 1 and assisted in the supervision of the institution's nursing care facility and diverse general population housing unit of 700 offenders. In 2008, Robbie was promoted to Unit Administrator 2, where she supervised the department's most severely mentally ill offenders in the Corrections Psychiatric Treatment Unit. So there you go. There's a little bit of her background. Apparently, she was one of the heavy pushers of this within the prisons. So you would ask yourself, like I said, why is it just now that they're paying attention? It's the same old story, because we care. Once the voters start caring, the legislators care. And it's interesting that there's not like a natural sense. If you get put with the job of saying, hey, the Jails Corrections Task Force, your job is to come in, regulate, and pass legislation on this, especially if you're appointed the chair of said committee. You would think, me being a normal person, that you would go ahead and want to really dig into this. I'm the chair of this committee. This is a big job. This is something that we're spending hundreds of millions of taxpayer funds on every year. I'm going to go learn about this. I'm going to read the regulations. I'm going to talk to prisoners. I'm going to talk to people working within the facility. I'm going to do more than just sit on my butt in a committee room calling for the top brass, which are not going to volunteer any information that they don't want me to know or anything that's going to make them look like they don't know what they're doing naturally. But instead, it goes on for years and, well, you've been funding it. You've been funding giving bras as standard issue to male inmates because the legislature never noticed, and of course, Democrats democrated. I mean, I get it. It's Beshear's administration. It's Beshear's group of people, and he's the one who's been doing it. I understand that, but it's kind of like, if a wild animal breaks in and eats your chickens, do you blame the wild animal or do you blame the person you tasked with building the pen to keep out that wild animal? It's the same thing. We know Beshear's a giant liberal freak, but we have a Republican legislature that is supposed to at least know better, and they're not doing the basic job of paying somewhat of attention to things that even they've specially tasked themselves to pay attention to. All right, in our final story, I want to touch on Casey Crosbie. Casey Crosbie was just endorsed by Donald Trump to replace Laura Trump as co-chair of the RNC. Casey Crosbie was the treasurer of the RNC, was elected to that position. Prior to that, she was part of the RNC National Committee. Every state gets to put 3 members of their committee up there. There is one, the chair, whoever that is, and then one committee man and one committee woman. So generally it's the party's chair for that state, committee man, and a committee woman, and she's been Kentucky's committee woman to the National Party for some time. And prior to that, though, in her involvement with the party, she was a city council member. Well, she's always been kind of involved with the party, but she's a city council member in Lexington. Her husband ran for mayor of Lexington. So she is from Kentucky. That's why it's worth talking about. Now, she did, of course, oversee, as treasurer, some record-breaking fundraising for the RNC. And obviously, Trump pulled off a victory. I know Casey Crosbie also cares a lot about things like election integrity, the Election Integrity Task Force. I believe she was a member of the Election Integrity Subcommittee on the RNC, and we did see a pretty good election integrity response from the RNC this year. They had on-demand response legal teams that when issues were discovered, they'd respond, having people in key positions in key states to make sure that the count is good and solid and is following the law. And we've seen several court cases that the GOP filed that they were involved in, and I know she's been a part of that. Now here locally, of course, Casey Crosbie has some different detractors. You have some detractors on the more establishment side, and you have some more detractors, I would say more so on the anti-establishment, liberty Republican type, conservative Republican side. Some people have called her a rhino or something like that. And then I do want to speak for a second, and this brings up, I think, a point here that I think is important. And, not every county party and not every person thinks like you in the GOP. And not every county party is like Boone County or Hardin County or Jessamine County, where it's largely made up of very either conservative or pro-Trump MAGA or liberty Republican or anti-establishment, whatever title you want to give them. They'll have their disagreements amongst them about various aspects of that, whether something's constitutional or not, whether they support something or not. But generally speaking, they take a more anti-establishment viewpoint. They look at Mitch McConnell and say this guy's a failure, he's not following his party and conservative thought. They recognize the fact that the Republican Party's leadership needs adjustment, that they're doing the bidding of kind of the donor class instead of the people voting for them and the party's rank and file. And they're fighting to change that, trying to get the party to be more involved. And not every single party's that way. Everybody's at different points. And especially when you're a part of a party that's in somewhere like Louisville or Lexington, you're going to have factions of the more, whether you want to call them the rhinos, but, It's weird to call them the rhinos because they've been like Republicans their whole lives, right? The more liberal Republicans is what I'll call them. People who kind of have, and I'm not trying to be mean here, but this name is going to sound mean. They have a loser mindset, right? Pretty much, they've always lost to the Democrats in their area, or they largely lose to the Democrats of their area, and so their loser mindset doesn't tell them, how do we take conservative principles and win over support to them by pointing out how these Democrat principles are failing and then campaigning on that, but rather let's just change ourselves to be more like the Democrats. And you'll see various thought processes coming out of these more liberal Republicans of things like, oh, well, if we just ran a black woman, we would win. Or maybe we just need to do X, Y, Z and we'll win. Oh, what we need to do? We need to have more outreach to the LGBTQ community and tell them that, we don't want to legislate them out of existence or whatever. And so basically saying, we're going to go against the Republican legislation regarding things like these transgender for kids and as such, right? And these are people that love McConnell. They'll pretend to like Rand now, but they hated Rand beforehand. They're definitely more the liberal type, where their version of the Republican Party, their version of being a quote-unquote conservative, is simply the government spends money in a way different than what the liberals wanted to spend money. Liberal Democrats or Democrats want it to spend money on. That basically they'll spend money on handouts and business and helping businesses in the area, kind of that trickle down, I guess you'd call it, economics thought process, compared to Democrats believe in spending money more directly, giving it to the people. But they both believe in spending money, and they both believe in government involvement in your lives, just in a little bit different places. Neither one of them agree on smaller government. And then meanwhile, you have a group of Republicans that say, generally speaking, we want smaller government. We want government to do the things they're supposed to do well and leave other things alone. That's the general thought process. And so these more liberal Republicans make up good chunks of places like the Fayette County Party and the Jefferson County Party. But they also make up good chunks of the Republican Party in general in Kentucky. I would say they're definitely not the majority anymore, but they are a pretty sizable group. And the thing about this group too as well is that they typically are bigger donors / volunteer a lot. I mean, you go into the Republican parties in many of these places that are still dealing with the fact that they're not really a very conservative county party. You're not going to find a lot of young volunteers. You're not going to find a lot of volunteers at all. Generally, you're going to find volunteers that are older than 60. And, that has its own difficulties as well. And a part of the reason why you're not going to find a whole lot of young volunteers in a lot of these parties is partially there's nothing, young people show up and nobody gives them a job or anything to do. But also, too, they start hearing people saying things in these concepts. Nothing will turn off a young Republican from wanting to volunteer and help out in a place or a county or in a group than hearing that everybody there just loves McConnell and thinks he's great. They're going to be, like it or not, you can disagree with their thought process, but young Republicans hate Mitch McConnell. They view him as an anti-conservative individual that cares more about sending our money overseas than stopping the Democrats from accomplishing their goals here at home. And granted, while those people who are older see a McConnell track record that goes back to the 80s, most young Republicans especially really haven't seen any McConnell different than what they've seen in the 2012 to 2016-ish time frame is when they started paying enough attention to politics to know who McConnell was and the decisions he's made. And I think in general, we should all at least be able to agree that a lot of the decisions that McConnell's made over the last 4 to 8 years go against generally what the base wants, which is why he has such a low approval rating even with his own party. But granted, these older people, they still love McConnell. And so that turns off the younger people and they turn away. And I bring all this up while talking about Casey Crosbie to say that you have to bridge, if you're going to be in the parties in these areas, you kind of have to bridge the gap right now between the two, if you want to straddle the two. Because what you would worry about if you have 25% of the party that's conservative, but if you continue to grow the party more and more of it will be this kind of conservative Republican. But you have 75% right now, or 60%, let's say right now, that are liberal Democrat or liberal Republicans. What do? Right? You get voted in as a chair, let's say, or you're trying to help the local party grow. And you got to what? Somehow get rid of the 60% majority that will disagree with some of your viewpoints and people that will be joining now, kind of running off the new class of incoming Republicans. And so they'll replace you, get rid of you, not want to work with you. You'll kind of be crippled for a while, or you won't even be in the position to reform. They'll put in somebody who'll just do whatever in order to attract in these conservatives, but at the same time, so you can't really get rid of them because they'll either A, get rid of you, or B, so nobody's going to make a difference, or B, there's just too many of them. They make up 60% of your party and they've been there for decades. What are you going to do? Get rid of people who've been a part of your local party for decades? Like, that's, I know people, I understand people say, rhinos and boomers and blah, blah, blah. But realistically, I mean, the chair, the party as a whole is serving, generally speaking, and Casey Crosbie wasn't the chair, but I'm just explaining these county parties. They're serving at and Casey Crosbie was the nationally elected committee woman, obviously, and you're serving at the will of those who make up the party. And while maybe only 10 to 20% of the general voters amongst the Republican Party make up that liberal Republican, for whatever reason, and there's deeper reasons, and we could dig into those in a different show, the majority of those in the party, at least in Kentucky, or a close majority, it's starting to whittle down a bit, are those of the more liberal Republican stance and viewpoint and view on what government should do and the Republican Party should do. So if you're elected as a member of that party and you yourself are more conservative Republican, you're more of a MAGA Republican, Liberty Republican, conservative Republican, whatever you want to call it, how you got to try to bridge the gap between the two. You see the future. The future is these conservative individuals, and if you want young people, you want to keep your party alive, you got to attract them in, but at the same time, you've got a majority of the party that fall into this other category that's kind of at war. How do you bridge that gap? And so I bring all that up to say there are some people who have problems with Casey Crosbie, and I think it has to do with mainly an attempt of trying to bridge that gap. Now, obviously, you go into Fayette County, there's personal foibles at play of, I like this person slighted me at this thing 10 years ago, so now I hate them, or I supported this candidate back in a primary 12 years ago, and they supported this other one, and, it got ugly, and so we never got along since then, and there's all those issues that go on locally. But I'm just saying that, when you look at a person coming up within the party and in this current situation, you want a person who's a conservative, but at the same time, they do have to bridge the gap between those that are more liberal and kind of straddle between the two camps and try to get everything to come together under a common purpose as best they can. And sometimes that involves trying to stay out of things. Sometimes that involves trying to sit down and facilitate conversations. Here's what I know about the Crosbies. I have talked with Casey. I've worked with Casey Crosbie on a few things before. I can tell you that, for a national committee woman, for a national treasurer to treasurer, not national treasurer, but national treasurer to the RNC, to care about local races. And I've worked with her on like local city council races or local county races. To care about those says she does care even about making a difference on the local level. Here's the other thing I'll say, is that during before Trump, before 2020, before getting rid of Ronna McDaniels, there was a big problem of the more liberal Republicans not wanting to work with Scott Presler. Now, Scott Presler is largely credited with the fact that Pennsylvania flipped, and he's been doing voter registration drives and door knocking drives and things like that for quite some time, and he's been out in the public square. But a lot of the more liberal Republicans, like Ronna McDaniels, didn't like Scott Presler because, of course, he's from that more conservative group. And recognizing him, giving him more to do within the party, they view as giving him more power. See, they don't care if they lose, just as long as they're still in power. But Casey Crosbie did work with Scott Presler and does recognized Scott Presler's value enough that during the Daniel Cameron campaign, for example, she did get Scott Presler to come into Kentucky for a few days there to at least work on and help encourage people to go out and knock doors. So that is a change from people like the Ronna McDaniels and more liberal Republicans. Now, I will say as well that, Casey Crosbie's husband, Scott, I've had some conversations with. He actually donated to my Treasures campaign. He did. So I guess you could, they're married, so you can't say Casey did, but Scott did. And he didn't donate a small amount either, per se. In fact, the Crosbies, if you look at them as a group, but just talking about Scott here, because I don't want to, put a husband's donation actions onto a wife. That doesn't mean anything necessarily, right? But Scott Crosbie, her husband, actually supported me more than, and was willing to be more public about his support for me in that Treasures race than even some people that you would typically identify as very conservative Republicans were willing to be. And they knew other people within the race. They knew the other two candidates had interacted with them a fair amount, but yet were still willing to support me. And that's big too, because Casey Crosbie ran for state treasurer, and she got the nomination as a primary, but lost in the general, ran for state treasurer in Kentucky as well. So the fact that they had ran for that position, understood what that position was, knew the other people within it, and yet Scott, her husband, donated to my campaign, kind of tells you the direction that they do kind of want the party to move in my head. Now, granted, that's Scott. That's not Casey, right? You can't say that, but I will say the fact that they supported me, and I've had some conversations with them that tell me that I believe they are more conservative Republicans. So I do believe, not just for Kentucky, but from a general standpoint of saying, hey, we want a more conservative Republican Party, I do think Casey Crosbie leads us there. And I know some of you will disagree. Some of you may have had interactions. Some of you may think she's a rhino. But the actions I've seen out of her and her husband, but out of her, mixed with the conversations, mixed with the care, tell me that I do think overall would definitely be a person who moves the party in the correct direction. Let's not forget the fact, too, that she was, I believe, the first person on the RNC to donate to Donald Trump, too. So, that tells you something. Tells you something. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining me. See you back here. I don't think you'll see me later this week, but we'll see you back here at least next week. Have a great rest of your day.